Hi everyone. Uh, in this video, I'm going to explain about some of the common errors faced while dealing with the Redis distributed cache. So let's start with it. Okay. So you would have encountered no connection is active or available to service this operation. So whenever you want to say you want to get some cache entry from your cache, or when you want to save some data to your cache, you will end up getting this error. No connection is active or available, and sometimes it was not possible to connect to the Redis server. Connection timeout. Okay, and timeout performing HMSET. This kind of errors you will usually encounter. So what are the some good practices we have to follow in order to avoid these kind of connection related issues? So let's start with it. So if you are making use of a connection multiplexer class, okay, this is the class basically using which Redis establishes connection with the Redis server and gets and sets your data on that Redis server. Okay, so if you are writing your own service which does all these get set operations, remove operations, then make sure this connection multiplexer object is lazy loaded. Whenever first time we try to reference it, right, then only this object should be created, and make it singleton in nature. Okay, this should be a singleton object. Okay, so next, it's developer's responsibility to dispose the connection by implementing iDisposable interface and calling connection multiplexer.dispose. Again, if you are not making use of iDistributed cache based implementation, you are writing your own service, then do understand. That's why I've highlighted in red. It's your responsibility to implement that service class iDisposable interface and implement the dispose method, and there you have to dispose the connection multiplexer, the connection class basically. Okay, check if you check if your Azure Redis cache and the client in the same region in Azure. So when we create this Redis cache resource in Azure, right, ensure that the client application which is going to access your Redis cache both falls into the same Azure region. So usually what I have seen is I have received some issues basically from the customer base or from the production environment, that sometimes the connection is timed out due to getting or setting this cache entries from your distributed Redis cache. So when we did the analysis, it has been found that okay, the distributed Redis cache has been created in a central US region, and the client application. Okay, so basically this Redis cache belongs to a central US region. You selected the region as central US, and the client application Kubernetes cluster or app service that you created is basically in central India. Okay, so because of this, what happens, sometimes the connection request, whatever request you made, the get or set operation timed out. Okay, it was not able to fulfill because of these regions distant apart. Okay, usually we won't see this, but very rare cases we have seen this kind of error. So always it's a best practice, you keep both the client as well as the Azure Redis cache in the same resource group, same region in the Azure basically. You need to always check whether you are using the latest version of stack exchange.redis nugget package. So usually they will keep on making enhancements, keep on adding new features. To always the best practice to keep on upgrading this nugget package and make use of the new features they are adding. Okay, sometimes it has been seen that you are making use of a very older version of this package, and because of this also it has resulted in connection errors like timeout errors or not able to establish the proper connection. Next, Redis cache is optimized to short key sizes. See, do remember guys, this is a very important point. Redis cache is optimized to short key sizes, typically 1 KB, and using larger key value sizes may cause Redis timeouts. Okay, a large value size may be okay if making only few requests at same time, but if high number of requests with the larger key value sizes in short time period can cause timeout issues on the Redis. Okay, so we have to take care of this because Redis is a single threaded system by design. Do remember this statement. By default, Redis is a single threaded system by design. Processing any large key value will block all other requests that come after. Okay, suppose you sent a request which has a very large key size as well as value size. Okay, so if it takes time to process that request itself, then it will block all other requests that are coming after, because it's in, basically it is single threaded and it is working synchronously here. Okay, so if the first large key value takes more time than expected, then next request will be timed out. So we have to take care of this. Always try to keep the key size as well as value size shorter. Okay. So actually they have tested Redis, Azure Redis Cache has been tested for larger key value sizes also, and it has performed well. But again, when you go beyond the threshold, you may encounter this kind of issues. So you have to take care of this. Well, sometimes your cache undergoes a planned or an unplanned server maintenance, okay, due to some outage on your Azure basically, okay, because of some outage due to some geolocation specific outages, due to some disaster, something took place, and because of that, if the server goes down, okay, your cache undergoes a planned or an unplanned server maintenance, there is a high chance that your application can be negatively affected during the maintenance. Okay, because the moment if your Redis cache went down, right, there is a chance that you may miss some data. Okay, so whenever there are maintenances, usually they will send the notifications, so we have to act according to that. Check if the max aggregate for connected clients metric is close or higher than the maximum number of allowed connections. Redis by default supports 10,000 client connections, okay, for a particular cache size. I think this is a much bigger value. We usually should not go beyond this value, okay, beyond this number of collections. So just make sure you are not exceeding this maximum number of allowed connections to your Redis server. Okay, so if you exceed, you will end up with the connection timeout errors, or you are not able to get active connection. You won't get the available active connection to serve your request. Okay, if your client application is hosted on Kubernetes, very important. Nowadays most of the web applications are basically moving to microservices architecture, and they are deployed on Kubernetes. So check that the pod running the client application or the cluster nodes aren't under memory, CPU, or network pressure. Okay, they should not be overloaded. Basically, a pod running the client application can be affected by other pods running on the same node. Okay, in a Kubernetes node there will be n number of pods, right? So that's what they are saying. A pod running the client application can be affected by other pods running on the same node and throttle Redis connections and IO operations. So you should ensure that memory, CPU, network should not be under pressure in Kubernetes node basically. If you are using a LSTIO or any other service mesh, check that your service mesh proxy reserves port 13,000 to 13,019 or 15,000 to 15,019. These ports are used by clients to communicate with a clustered Azure cache for Redis nodes, and could cause connectivity issues on these ports. So these ports should be available for Redis, guys. Okay, we have to ensure this. Next is virtual network configuration for Azure Redis cache. Check if a virtual network is assigned to your cache from the virtual network section. Okay, if you go to your Azure portal, and when you locate your Redis cache resource, so in the left navigation pane, usually you can see this option virtual network. Okay, so check if a virtual network is assigned to your cache from the virtual network section under the settings on the resources menu of the Azure portal. Ensure that the client host machine is in the same virtual network. See, you must ensure the client machine or the web app server, okay, web application server which want to access your Azure cache should be on the same virtual network. Okay, otherwise you may end up with connection errors. Okay, when the client application is in different VNet from your Azure cache for Redis, both VNet virtual networks must have a VNet peering enabled within the same Azure region. Okay, so this will be done by DevOps most of the times, but remember, this is the action you have to take if you are facing or if you are using virtual network configuration for your Azure Redis cache. Requirement is very simple. Okay, the Azure Kubernetes cluster and your Azure Redis cache should be under same virtual network. Okay, move on. Mm, private endpoint configuration. Okay, one more important stuff. So Azure Redis provides an option to create private endpoints basically. So you can create a private endpoint, and for that endpoint, you get a private endpoint connection string. So basically, all the communication will happen only through that private endpoint. Okay, most of the times I have seen this scenario where people are making use of that. So public network access flag is disabled by default on creating a private endpoint. Okay. So do remember, private endpoints can be created only when you are creating your Azure Redis cache for the first time. So when you create a Azure Redis cache resource for the first time on your Azure portal, right? Only that time you can create a private endpoint. After once your Azure Redis cache has been created successfully, you can't add private endpoints. So just remember this point, guys. Okay. So by default, public network access flag is disabled. So when you create a private endpoint, ensure that you have set the public network access correctly when you have your cache in Azure portal. Look under private endpoints in resources menu, which I already explained. If you are trying to connect to your cache private endpoint, okay, if you are trying to connect to your cache using the private endpoint from outside your virtual network of your cache, public network access needs to be enabled. Remember this. Okay, if your web application server or a Kubernetes pod is outside of your virtual network, okay, then in that case you have to enable this flag public network access. Otherwise you will get connection error. Connection itself will not be established. Okay, so that's why they are saying we need to provide extra caution when you are making use of virtual networks for your cache. Your cache is basically residing on a virtual network, and your client is out of your virtual network, and if it is trying to access this cache, it won't work. You have to enable public network access. If you have deleted your private endpoint, okay, while creating the Redis cache resource itself, you created a private endpoint, but later you thought that you want to go with the public access and you deleted the private endpoint. Ensure that that time also you have to enable the public network access flag to true. There is a check box basically that you have to enable. This is must. Otherwise you will get connection error. Verify if your private endpoint is configured correctly. For more information, okay, we can check the MSDN documentation. They have created a way, they have basically given more information on that. Okay, so you can check how to configure private endpoint with the new Azure Cache for Redis instance. Okay, verify if your application is connecting to yeah, Redis cache on port 6380. Okay, so what Microsoft recommend, that Microsoft recommend avoid use of cache name.private-link.redis cache in the configuration or the connection string. So you should always use this kind of connection string, cache name.redis.cache.windows.net. Don't use the private links. Okay, so that's the recommended practice, and it should be using the port 6380. Firewall. Yeah, one important rule, yes, that is very important. So whenever we create a new Azure Redis cache, sometimes the Azure by default adds, or your organization policy by default add uh, IP address range over here, start IP address and end IP address for the firewall. Okay, it creates a default firewall rule with those IP addresses. So what happens is, we have experienced this issue. If you have a firewall configured for your Azure cache, for it is ensure that your client IP address is added to the firewall rules. You can check firewall on this particular resource menu under settings on the Azure portal. So what happens is, suppose if the web app server which is trying to access your uh, Redis cache, okay, if it is trying to access your Redis cache, and if that particular web application server's IP address doesn't fall into this firewall configured rules, right, the start IP address, end IP address, your connection will fail. Okay, you won't be able to create a connection itself. So that's why best practice, if you are going with the public access cache, for a public access cache, if you see any rules in this section containing IP address ranges, then delete them. That's what I'm referring. If you are going with a public access cache, which is most of the time many people prefer to do that, because you don't know which pod which Kubernetes cluster will be allocated to you and under which pod your application will be running. You can't take those IP addresses. Those IP addresses sometimes changing, okay, based on the scheduling done by Kubernetes. Okay, so in order to avoid such a mess and keep on adding such IP addresses into your firewall rule, what I would prefer is go with the public access cache. Okay, and if there are any IP address ranges added by default, delete them and save it. That's it. Post this, you will be able to establish the connection, and yeah, it will start working. We had specifically faced this issue. So our one of Azure bot service was making use of this distributed Redis cache, and we were spinning a new environment. So all setup was correct, but still the conversation and the messages were not displaying on the bot. After doing a lot of analysis for hours, we found that the connection establishment was not happening properly with the Redis. And when we go to the settings of Redis cache, we found that there was a default range of IP address added. So after removing that, it started working. Okay, guys. So that's the important thing. Just remember. And as on the date of creating this video, okay, so what happened is basically on June 30th, basically, okay, 2023, Microsoft will retire version 4. Okay, so today is the 21st June, so that's what recently we have received an update. So Microsoft will retire version 4 of Azure Cache for Redis instances. So before that date, that is June 30, we have to upgrade any of our cache instances which are in version 4 to version 6. So all cache instances running Redis version 4 after June 30th will be upgraded automatically by Microsoft itself. One good thing, okay, all instances which are on version 4 will be automatically upgraded to version 6 of the Redis cache. All cache instances running Redis version 4 that have geo replication enabled will be upgraded automatically after August 30th. See, so if you want it to happen automatically, then you have to wait till August 30th. Okay, but if you want to do it, then you can go ahead and upgrade to version 6 by your own. When you upgrade a cache in the basic tier, okay, it's unavailable for several minutes. So see, if you are using a basic tier for your Azure Redis cache, then when making this upgrade from version 4 to version 6, it will be unavailable for several minutes and results in data loss. So you have to take care of this. Upgrading on geo-replicated cache isn't supported. You must manually unlink the cache instances before upgrading. Okay, first you have to unlink it from the geo-replication functionality, and then you have to upgrade. So just remember this important point, and yeah, I think this should help you people with the migration. So that's all about this video. Thank you for listening, guys, and have a nice day. And one more thing, yeah. So one important point will comes to the picture over here. Okay, we have all these many configuration. Okay, so in order to make use of this kind of distributed caches, we have to pay for it, we have to get it created, we have to take care of the respective code maintenance, everything, right, guys? So it's always makes sense to think properly when you are designing your system. Okay, what you have to do is you have to think whether a distributed caching which can be achieved using your SQL server, because Microsoft provides support for a distributed caching using your SQL server also. Okay, the backend store, instead of Redis cache, it will be a Microsoft SQL server. So basically it's the same functionality you are going to achieve using a SQL server in the background. Okay, so when you design this kind of caching, it's up to you. It's all depends on your budget, how much money you have in your hand or your client can afford. Okay, so it's not a straightforward decision that if my application requires a distributed caching, so directly I will go for Redis. No, you have to think in terms of budget, you have to think in terms of the money which client can afford. If client says that no boss, I can't afford this kind of expensive resources, then of course you have to come up with alternatives, and you have to think of implementing distributed cache in other way, like providing a backend store of Microsoft SQL server instead of using the Redis cache basically. So do remember this, things can be done not paying money also, things can be done by paying money also. Only thing is this kind of readily available solutions ease your burden of writing extra code. Okay, and also they provide all the, also they take all the maintenance overhead on their side. But when budget is a constraint, then you have to come up with your own implementation. So there's always a trade-off that you have to think of before picking any approach for your application development. Okay, so thank you for listening and have a nice day, guys.